Start our recording now. Hello from a cloudy Scotland. Well, I hope the sunshine comes to you later on today. I saw a weather forecast earlier, it should change from yesterday. Things were looking brighter for the whole of the UK. And Andrew's just saying that he'll be with us very shortly. Apologise for the bright light behind my camera image. That is the sunshine in Kent. I'm not used to it coming through that window at this time of day. I'll try and hang something up there later. Warm London. And from California. I've lost count now of how many countries people have logged in from. Certainly seems to be quite global. And cloudy Nottingham too. Okay. We are on the appointed hour. I'm now going to go off camera and hand over to Andrew Jacobs. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you very much, James. And thank you and welcome, everybody. Delighted that you've all come to join this session. Delighted and thank you to Don and the team for giving me the opportunity to have a chat with you. Don asked me to think about a session for this, and I've noticed from where I am working for HM government just some of the challenges around lockdown in a normal day-to-day workplace, and I thought, well, actually from a learning and development perspective, what might that be like as well? So this session will be quite participative because I really want to find out what some of the things that you've been doing as well around meeting the challenge of COVID-19. Just to give you a little bit of background, where you can find me on Twitter. That's an easy way to get hold of me, Andrew Jacobs, LND. LND standing for Lost and Desperate, which is the name of my website as well. I blog on my website on a daily basis, generally on random topics and things that I find quite interesting. And you can find me via LinkedIn as well, where again, you'll just find me ruminating on different things. So let's have a think about COVID-19, shall we? It's not really been that difficult and much of a change, has it, for everybody? Or is it just me? How was L&D during COVID-19 lockdown for you? Thank you very much, James. There's a poll up there, and the 200 or so people that are here, I would like you to tell me how learning and development during lockdown was for you. So not how lockdown it was, but actually learning and development during lockdown. Because I think we're in a very interesting period of time here, which I think is we're being challenged, and then we'll talk about this in a little while. This is interesting. I'm looking at the results. I had a lot of results through already. Goodness me. Wow, it's 160 votes or 150 votes already. Pretty good, most people are saying. This is a surprise. I have to admit I'm surprised. I notice I've only had, I had one vote for perfect, and then 0, and then 1, and it's gone back to 0 again. So it's not been perfect for anybody. I'm also really pleased that non-existent is actually very low as well. I'll just give a moment or two because I can see more people joining the call. How was learning and development during COVID-19 lockdown for you? Not talking again as how was the lockdown generally, but thinking about learning and development generally. How was learning and development during COVID-19 for you? And that could be you delivering it, or it could be you receiving it. We'll unpack some of that in a moment. I'll just give it a moment. Any more results? Last few trickling through. Excellent stuff. Okay. Let's pull this apart a little bit. I'm really interested in, well, what made things good and what made them poor. So if you said that actually it was pretty good, tell me why. In the text boxes there, tell me why it was pretty good. And if it was pretty poor, tell me why you think it was pretty poor. Let's have a look at some of these. I'm going to do some of the good ones first, and then we'll come back to some of the poor ones after. Okay, Caroline, that's really interesting. So colleagues sharing links to sessions. Yeah, there's something about a sharing culture that seems to have come out a little bit, which I find quite interesting. Let's have a look. Oh, they're scrolling through very quickly. Goodness me, so many people. What have we got here? Business is starting to understand the value of L&D. Absolutely. Karen, less time spent travelling, so more time for learning development. That's a really interesting one. I was making some jokey tweets very early on within the process where I was saying, okay, so within the first 10, 20 minutes of a day, you know, my commute had gone from 20 minutes to 20 seconds. But that less commuting time, actually I found that I wasn't listening to podcasts as much as I was. But what I was doing was then using that time in a very different way. Concentration was better, says Morris. Fewer distractions. That's interesting, Morris, because some people would say there's been more distractions, but yeah, absolutely. Lauren Jacobs, well done, Lauren, the best name, obviously. Allowed to make our company as a whole become more digital. Well done, Lauren. Yeah, being more digital, I think, is some people have noticed that, and we're seeing a lot more leverage around that as well. Organisation adopting flexible delivery, says James, and I think there's something about responsiveness in flexibility in delivery, which is really important. I'm really interested in seeing how people have said these things are good. Time to develop yourself, says Rob. That's really interesting because, again, some people have said they've actually had no time to develop themselves because they're doing more work. Sue says it's been easier to reach out to customers. Is that because they can't avoid you, Sue? Is that what it is, perhaps? I don't know. Building the learning culture through the technology in a burning platform. That's really interesting, Cheryl. I think that you're probably very right there as well. All of a sudden, the platform was necessary and was burning and forcing us to change and do things differently. And Caroline has picked up a point which I think many people would have had. As I'm furloughed, I have the time. Absolutely, yeah, and being part of the organisation that helped work out how to pay the furloughing, I can understand. Just having a little look through what's made some of these things poor. So, Natalie says, our only offer pre-COVID was classroom-based training. So I'm assuming, Natalie, that means that you've had no offer at all during the lockdown. If that's the case, I'm really sorry for you, and I can understand how frustrating that would be. Zara said a lack of technology, and yeah, absolutely, Zara, I've seen that around as well. And Sylvia, too much poor content everywhere, which I think is a really interesting one. Everybody seemed to have an opinion. I wrote about this a couple of months ago, well, March, about how everybody seemed to have an opinion, an idea about, well, actually what you should be doing during lockdown. But actually, a lot of it was very poor and just being repeated, and it was the same stuff that was coming out. Restricted budgets, Andy, absolutely, and budget cuts as Daria as well. There's definitely some stuff to do with budget in there as well. Interesting to see a lack of support while on furlough, and that's a real shame. Again, while people are being furloughed, we are limited and people are limited, and there's a lot of people furloughed, as Leanne says. It's how we use some of those things. I'm really interested in the what's good and what's not. Lots of new projects, a little time, Katerina, trust me, I absolutely get that one. You might have seen the job replacement scheme and the self-employed income support scheme. Yeah, they were little projects, but were done incredibly quickly, which were we had to work on very, very quickly. Just looking at some of the other comments here. One-off Zoom meetings is not the way, says Mohammed. We need searchable, persistent, recorded video, categorised, interactive, and linked to current knowledge management systems. I think there's definitely something to do with categorisation, Mohammed. I think there's definitely something to do with making things easier to find. I definitely agree with you on that. And Martin, Zoom fatigue, absolutely. There's definitely something to do with cognitive load. And how much you're able to manage in terms of cognitive load. If you're doing an input, if you're doing an input, you're doing an input, is too much. Okay, there's some fabulous stuff here. absolutely fabulous stuff. And what I think is really interesting is that you're picking out all the things that we were battling with when we were thinking about this within HMRC. What will be good and what will be poor as well. Fabulous input, and thank you for your responses. If you want to keep, we will pick these out and we will include them within a resources pod so that we'll be able to see some of these afterwards. And again, go back through the recording and have a look through. What we did within HMRC is we identified very early on that there were going to be some restrictions placed on us because of COVID-19. And you know, you pulled out some of these things already. The first one was that there was going to be no face-to-face in-person learning. We couldn't do it. Our offices are closed. They have been closed and will remain closed for some time still. Particularly in some of our tax programs, a lot of that learning will be face-to-face. So we weren't going to be able to do that. So that placed an almighty restriction on how we're going to be able to take some of the learning forward. So secondly, the second effect from that potentially was that some programs were suspended for indeterminate duration. So we have apprenticeship programs where we bring on new apprentices within the organisation, and those programs were suspended. And we didn't know when they were going to restart because we didn't know how the situation was going to pan out. So again, another very strong restriction. Some of you said this as well, resources directed to other projects. Like I mentioned before, the job replacement scheme, or the JRS, and the self-employed income support scheme. Those systems themselves were actually built on people's dining room and kitchen tables. But then what we had to do was, once we worked out the systems and the policies, we then had to train everybody. And so pretty much everybody within our tax academy was diverted to training the 20 or 1,000 colleagues who were going to need to understand those that content to be able to support people. And that couldn't go wrong. Yeah, we had a hard deadline on that. That could not go wrong. Another restriction was just going to be on the delivery in terms of learning. So the learn delivery experience was going to be very different for people. And we did have to think about how we could change that. And lastly, the online usage going through the roof. So some of the restrictions we had were how we could use learning technology where we still had restricted bandwidth. So we did have some challenges around how much we could do online and how much we could do digital. And so that became a restriction around what we thought we could do. What it did do, though, is it also provided us with some opportunities. And the first one is something that I think a number of organisations have encountered, is it was potentially a time to hit Control, Alt and Delete, to do shutdown, to do restart, and to think about how you could redesign your learning differently. I see the question, Tracy, as you put in the chat, do I feel made us more agile? I think there is a potential for it to be more agile. Whether organisations have actually seized that as an opportunity, I think is something different. And that goes partly to do with some of the content I'll talk about in terms of redesign. Another opportunity that we found was an opportunity to get ahead of the business. So while the business was facing a very, very specific issue right up here now, the job replacement scheme and the self-employed scheme, what was going to happen in 3 months' time? So we were thinking generally, we thought to a 10-day, 10-week, 10-month ahead. So what would you expect in 10 months? What would you expect in 10 weeks? What would you expect in 10 days? And what might the opportunities come out across those three different 10s? Another opportunity is, effectively with this pause, then we could look through our libraries of content. We could have a look at all of the extra resources that we had and actually think about all of the resource that we could use for other things. And there was an opportunity to actually curate some of that resource and just think about how we might be able to use that in the future. And the last opportunity that came to us was about practicing and role modelling new learning and development activity. If we were going to be working differently, which we are, and we're going to have to be doing learning differently, which we are, well then actually we had a really strong opportunity to help our colleagues in learning in HMRC understand how to do learning differently. So we thought that this was a super opportunity to be able to show people and just role model and walk through some of the change that we thought that we could try within the organisation. Helen Dudfield, do I think lockdown has affected learner groups differently? Oh, very much so. But I don't. My only concern with that, Helen, would be I wouldn't put it down as learner groups. I think it's people. I have a concern if we're labelling people as a particular learning group. I think that the issues you will have as a man and a woman will be different because of potentially caring responsibilities. The issues that you will have during lockdown, whether you have family or not, the issues you will have depending on where you live, whether you live in a town, a city, or within the country. Different challenges depending on your support networks. I don't think it's necessarily learner groups. I think it's people groups. And what we should be doing is thinking it from a people angle rather than thinking of it from a learning perspective. Absolutely, I think it does affect people differently, and it's affected groups of people, but not necessarily learner groups per se. So some problems, some opportunities, some restrictions. So we needed to have a think about, well what could we do here? So I've been at HMRC for about 2 years. I spent a lot of time actually looking. My role title is Learning and Development Transformation Lead. So my role is to transform learning and development across HMRC. So actually, this was manna from heaven for me. This was the perfect opportunity. So I pulled together all of the issues that I thought we'd had, and actually went, well, what are the 6 realistically? We drawed it down into 6 core areas. So the first area that I thought that we needed to do some work on was around assessment and evaluation. And the 2 parts for that, assessment of individuals and evaluation of learning content. If we've traditionally, for example, told people that we're going to sit you in a classroom and do you a closed book exam, and now we can't do that, then we have to think fundamentally differently about how we're going to assess. And what I also wanted to do was use the opportunity to think about evaluation and actually think, well, how could we evaluate differently? So spent some time thinking about input data, output data, outcome data, and how we might need to measure some of those things differently relating to the technology that we now had available. We couldn't, for example, rely on happy sheets if you're asking people just to go and watch videos, which is exactly the same as we do now within the day-to-day process. But all of a sudden now we're doing it under COVID-19 conditions. So we're thinking, well, how can we collect some of that data? We needed to think about how we could build communities. Part of the glue, as some people said, is going into the office and meeting people, and those face-to-face conversations that you have around a water cooler and making a cup of tea. Now, I don't know about you, but I go and make a cup of tea in my office and I spend 5 minutes making the tea and chatting with whoever's there. Now, if I make a cup of tea, I walk into my kitchen, I go and get my tea, I bring back and I sit at my desk. So I don't get those individual pauses, potentially. So how do you build those pauses to allow people to build and work in a community perspective? And understanding how those communities already existed and how we could tackle into those communities and how we could create space for people and create environment for people in order to be able to do that was rather different than just saying, here's a space, we want you to now talk about things. I'll pause for a second, just have a look and see if there's any other questions coming through. I agree, Caroline, we don't do anywhere near our evaluation. Bottom line is because we don't know what we're counting. In the most part, we count the input rather than count the outcome. And I think you're right, Natasha. Different support networks, different personality types, absolutely. We'll respond differently to these things. I agree entirely. So the third area that we thought about working through and developing our teams was on about how to deliver face-to-face online. And so there's a couple of aspects around that. The first one is, how do we design and deliver asynchronously? In the past, we would rely on people coming to us a fixed date, a fixed time, and a fixed location in order to learn something from us. We couldn't do that any longer. And was it reasonable to do that? We were designing much more flexible working. People were designing and working in a much more flexible way. logging in early in the morning, logging off late at night. Would it be reasonable to expect somebody to sit in front of a computer screen between 9 o'clock and 4 o'clock for us to talk at them? And I saw it beautifully referenced in a blog post last week. I think it was Miles Runham said, or he noted a comment where someone said they wouldn't sit and watch their favourite band for 6 hours. And it's quite a valid point. If you couldn't sit and watch a video of your favourite band for 6 hours, why would somebody want to sit and listen to you talk about GDPR for 6 hours? Or coaching skills, or whatever the topic happens to be. So we needed to think about the face-to-face skills. We needed to think about the skills of the facilitators. We need to think about our trainers who largely have never delivered any online activity. And then we also need to think about designing for digital as well. Designing for digital is very, very different. Unfortunately, what we've done in the past, like many other organisations, is we've used digital to supplement face-to-face content, and now actually we had to think about putting it at the front. And so how you put the content forwards in a way that people could access it, and then be able to tie that in with some social activity. I'll pause a second, look for some other comments. Interesting to see some of the other reactions. Virtual Uzma has said virtual coffee mornings. Absolutely. Yeah, virtual coffee mornings. What was interesting is we did have some fixed sessions. We had a fixed time where we had a thing at 1 o'clock every day. And what was interesting is how very quickly that ran out of steam. Quite simply because we were a bit like the Field of Dreams effect. You know, if we build it, they'll come. Well, some people did. But actually we ended up with sort of like a reverse Fibonacci effect where, you know, half the people came the second day, half the people came the next day, half the people came the next day, and eventually by, you know, 8 or 10 days in, people just stopped coming. But there we go. For the fifth aspect that I thought we needed to look at was around resources and curation. So, we had the opportunity to pause and look at all the resources that were available to us, and to actually think about curation as a specific activity. So in one of the sessions I got Martin Cousins, who, you know, what he doesn't know about curation you can write on the back of a postage stamp, and had a conversation with him about, well, how can we help people understand what curation is and how can we use some of the resources that we've already got. And the last section was about personal development. So this was actually throwing into the group of trainers and the group of people who work in learning and development. Oh, sorry, Liz has just asked, what do I mean by curation? So curation of resource, Liz, apologies, sorry. It's about the gathering of resources, placing them together, potentially around a form of narrative, making them available to people for them to download and use and understand at a time when it's appropriate for them. So instead of putting somebody into a course, excuse me, oh dear, sorry. Sorry, frog in the throat, I do apologise. So curation would be gathering the resources together, the things that already exist, and then making them available for people to draw down at a time and a day when it's appropriate for them, rather than creating resources and building resources and making them available for them. So the personal development element, so in terms of personal development, that was about helping people understand what we mean by modern workplace learning. So picking up on Jane Hart's ideas, what's modern learning theory, helping to break some of the myths. So we had some, we thought about having some conversations around learning styles. We had some conversations around learning theory. We talked about some of the theories that we still rely on. We talked about some of the myths in learning. We talked about some of the legends, you know, the Moravian 78-12-5 or whatever it is, you know, in terms of body language and learning styles and video, audio, kinesthetic and all of those kind of things. And we thought it would be useful to have some conversations around those areas as well. So effectively, those were the 6 areas that we thought. Those were the areas that we thought would be useful for people. And what I think I would like to do is to ask you the same kind of question that I asked them. So out of those 6, and you can choose as many of these as you like, out of those 6, what would have been your top 3 sessions that you think you would have liked some support with. I'm really interested to see how this compares to things you thought that were pretty good. So if it went pretty good for you, which most of you said it was pretty good, I wonder how many sessions people would actually sign up for here. It's really interesting. I think this is also really interesting for us from the summer forum perspective, is to see, well, what sessions are people wanting to put themselves onto this week, I think, Don. I think it's also having a look and seeing, well, what resources are available for people, but I think it also ties into your global sentiment survey, Don, I know you're here as well, as to, well, what are the things that people think they need? Okay, give people a second or so. I think the trends have been already decided. Seems to be. Wow, I am really surprised by that. I am really surprised by that. Okay. Let's unpack this a bit as well, shall we? What's made you jump out? So let's just go back to the poll here. I'm not going to say anything else about the poll results. You've got the poll results there. What surprises you about those poll results? What are you surprised by? What do you think is interesting about those poll results? Yeah, the top two trophy, absolutely. Those two, absolutely storming ahead. That's really interesting. Isabel, there's many resources designing for digital, yet we want more. And absolutely, I think that was brilliant, Oksana, absolutely. So we're talking about designing for digital, yet resources and curation seems very, very low. With Rob Kearns, lovely, digital's been around, but it looks like no one is doing it well, so is it we want more? Absolutely. Not more people value their personal development, Linda. Absolutely. I think that's really interesting as well. Caroline's picked up the poor resources and curation score as well. Darren's also picked up about personal development, and Sam has picked up about resources and curation as well. COVID panic, says Martin. That's really interesting, Martin. I think that's really interesting. Yeah, so what's the immediate ask from your business that your business is asking you? Your business is immediately saying to you, yeah, give us face-to-face online, give us digital. Absolutely. Don, thank you. The most popular session is delivering engaging online sessions. Well, there we go. So you've got 122 people here who'd be signing up for that in the first place. Absolutely. Sylvia says resources and curation should be the first. And, okay, Nick, I wonder, do the other sessions feed into designing for digital? Okay, I'll come back to that point, Nick. Thank you. Because, yeah, there's a little bit of a cheat that falls into this one. Unfortunately, yeah, it is full on the session, I'm afraid. I think most of the sessions are full in the summer forum, which is fabulous because as people taking the opportunity. And John, that's a really interesting question. L&D are typically measured, or comment rather, I should say, L&D typically measured on delivery rather than connection to the business. Now, the business can see designing or delivering face-to-face online. The business can see output that's been redesigned. What the business can't see necessarily is the work that you do on community. The business can't see an immediate effect of the assessment and evaluation. They can't see an immediate benefit through resources and curation. That's a really interesting point. Thank you very much. That's a really, really good spot. That's a really good spot. Thank you, John. I appreciate that. That's a good spot. Cool. I'll just give people a couple more moments. Hopefully personal development is low, says Chantel, because businesses are focused on this area more during lockdown. Absolutely, yeah. We might be doing this, Chantel, absolutely. This might be because people feel that their personal development has been picked up. And Gareth says he's been banging on about resources and curation for years with not much progress, to be honest. I do get the one online system, but then it's reorganised, it was switched off due to pounds, absolutely. Yeah, pounds comes to everything. If you want to get in touch with me, Gareth, we can have a great conversation about nil or neutral cost tools. So feel free. A lot of communications tools for community and learning during COVID-19. Absolutely, Don. And I think those new tools coming up is what is throwing up maybe some of these responses as well. So what's the skills that you need to deliver face-to-face and online, using these new tools? What are the tools around designing for digital, and how do you design with these new nil or neutral tools. And Karen says the TikTok count, absolutely, yeah. People are seeing these new tools and thinking to themselves, okay, well, how do I use these tools now? Absolutely. No substitute for experience, says James. Okay, I'm going to move us on because we're going to run out of time otherwise, and we won't have opportunity for any questions. But thank you for your comments on that. Really useful. We will pull those out, and we will extract some of those questions and those comments, and we'll include them within the resource pack. Thank you for engaging with that. So, what effectively we did were, these were the design principles that we used around that. So you picked out pretty much the areas that my organisation did as well. Personal development was very low. The only difference in my organisation was assessment and evaluation was very much higher. So what we did is we used digital design principles. We thought about, well, actually, how do we need to design this? How do we design this in a way that everybody can access it? And that's thinking about using the tools that we had and thinking about the opportunity for access for people. I work clockwise or anti-clockwise, so we did this in small groups. So effectively ran this as small group sessions, 6, 8, 10, 12 people at a time. And what we did was very, very short term. They were only 45-minute duration. So we ran 30 plus sessions, only for 45 minutes. What we did is, in between the sessions, we fed content in. So we talk about curation, we fed curated activity in. We relied on user-generated links and content which they fed in themselves. And what that did is then built the community. So the way the sessions were built, they were built in Microsoft Teams. Colleagues were able to access the Microsoft team at any time, day or night. So if you'd missed the session, it didn't matter because you could see the chat that other people had put in there. You could see the slide decks at any time as well. You could look at the links that other people had placed in there. So what we had was effectively a curated resource all in one place that people could access whenever they want. And what that meant is that we hit that asynchronous approach. And what we decided to do was to then take a success case method approach to evaluation. So we started the evaluation process. We started looking to understand how the evaluation is. What was important, and it was just picked up beautifully by Nick, was that everything is connected. So what we did was we relied on assessing it and evaluating it, using it through a community approach, by curating content, by using digital design principles, and delivering good online skills delivery to show people how it could be done. So effectively, although there were 6 areas, what we did was we did all 6 areas effectively through all parts of it. The program's been successful. The program has initially hit 250 odd people over some 30 odd sessions. We're doing a further 10 or 12 sessions over the next couple of weeks because the demand has just been through the roof. People saying they just want more opportunity, and interestingly the ones that they're asking more for are digital design and digital delivery. So the SCM USMA success case methodology, sorry USMA, I just saw the question, success case methodology by a guy called Robert O. Brinkerhoff. If you look it up, it's a different approach towards evaluation. Yeah, so 200 odd attendees through 30 odd sessions, and what we've done to start off with in terms of our evaluation is firstly identify the strong performers. With success case methodology, what you're looking for are the outliers. You're looking for the people who've taken this content. So I'm looking for the 10, 12 people who are taking it forward particularly high. And I'm also looking for the 4, 5, 6 people who actually haven't done anything with it. And we started surveying to establish what that looks like. Second step we're going to do is agree, well, what are the capacity changes that we need to build in? If we've identified that we have to fundamentally think about a shift to design, well then we have to say, okay, well what's that shift in design now going to look like? And how might we have to build capacity into our system to make that happen? And then we have to agree process change. That's the third part. So we have decided that we're going to do some stuff differently relating to learning and development. We have decided we're going to do some stuff differently to assessment and evaluation. Well, what might that look like in the future? And we started bringing some of that process change in. We're doing that with our group of apprentices at the moment who are going through this assessment. I realise there is hundreds of questions that have all popped up. But really keen to answer some of your questions, and I can see some of the questions as they've come up in here. Just pause for a moment while I take another drink, if that's okay. Okay, so looking through some of the questions, let's have a look. From Caroline, you asked, how do we know learning has been translated to the workplace? I think the important one there, Caroline, is what we do is we think about 3 elements in terms of measurement. Like I said, think about the input data. So what input have you had? What input data can you establish? And that might be the numbers of bums on seats, that might be the number of modules that have been completed. It's data of activity. Then what you want to be looking at is the output data. So there you're saying, okay, so as an effect of the person doing this, this is what they then did. So if it's something tax related, I would expect to see something relating to the time that the claims are processed. The third level would then be outcome data. So what I'd be looking at there is if claims are processed quicker, I would expect an individual would be turning in a higher yield or a reduced period of time, something like that. And so it's connecting all 3 of those at the same time to be able to prove the value. So that means actually understanding and having a focus on the outcome before you're designing it. So what we did with the job replacement scheme, for example, and the self-employed income support scheme, we were very clear. We didn't know how many people were going to apply. What we did have was some very clear outcome measures of how quickly those things had to be turned around and so on. So we had some very clear data. Let's have a look here. Looking through the other comments. How would they define quality, says Nick, relating to curation? So that's a really good point, Nick, and thank you. So we did have some really interesting conversations in the sessions around curation. And effectively we said that actually what you have is a 3-part measure for the quality. And that 3-part measure is that do you have a good, strong source, so the first source of data? Secondly, do you have a second source? And that second source could be contrary, it could be supportive, it could be complementary, but you had to have a second source to actually prove the value of the first source. And the third piece we found was that you had to have some context. The quality of the data was only as good as the context in which it was being used in. So if I have the best data in the world, or the best piece of information in the world, but I'm unable to use it, it's no meaning, it has no quality. The worst piece of data, it actually in the best context might actually be more worthwhile because it will show me how not to do something. So in terms of curating quality, make sure you've got your original piece, and it should be from a good source. But you should have a second source, and the third part to triangulate it will be the context that you would then work it in. Interesting here, let's have a look. Tristan Hale from Sphere. How can I persuade learners on a 4-week course to engage with collaboration tools, e.g. MS Teams used for discussion and Q&A? That's a really interesting one, Tristan. So what I'd be asking the question is how people actually engaging in those tools in the first place. So how many people are using those tools, and what channels are they using already? Now, if they're not using channels, then you've got a double ask. So first you've got to get to start collaborating, and then collaborating with your tool. So I'd actually try and find out what tools and channels they're using already. And that would be the first place that I would look for. It's likely to be an email, and which is a binary process. I send you a message, you send me a message, and we ping things about. What I do find is that, or what I do find interesting is that we like keeping conversations binary, and there's a couple of reasons for that. Number one is you can control the flow of information, but secondly, you own it as well. As soon as things become public, you lose that power and that control. So I would take things out of email, I think would be useful. So try and find out how people are communicating. Try and find it if it is in email. And if somebody asks you a question, reply to them via Teams. So I had people email me and said, Andrew, I didn't get to that session. Could you explain XXX a bit for me? And what I would do is then go into Microsoft Teams, and I would type in Teams, and I would tell people what I was doing in Teams, and then link to the Teams point to try and encourage people to actually get involved in that one space. Ali has asked, could I get a bit of background context? How many trainers, size of audience, or type of training do I use e-learning? Okay, so across HMRC, we've got about 1,000 employees who are involved in training activity. So in terms of people, it's quite a sizable audience, but actually picking which people we would get the most benefit from, what we did was start with our Tax Academy. Our Tax Academy simply because they're the professional tax trainers. They're the people who work with our customer compliance group to make sure that things are done properly. And what we do now is working with our customer service group. And there's a range of other groups that we've done some work with. So we've worked with our Criminal Justice Academy, we've worked with our solicitors groups, etc. We've worked with a range of different groups. What we found is, in terms of audience, is everybody wants to do a good job, and we forget this sometimes. Everybody actually wants to do a really good job, but they don't necessarily know what a good job is. And what this is has been a brilliant opportunity to show people about how to do things a little bit differently. What have we got here? Grant. Very little digital presence. Difficult to know what was the best and easiest digital delivery. That's a really interesting one. So I would never suggest go out and buy a platform because somebody says that this is the right platform. I would go out and understand, well, actually, what can you use and can't you use, nil or neutral cost. I'm really interested in the announcement from Microsoft last week, where they talked about coming up with a learning system built within Teams. That could be a game changer. I'd be very surprised if that doesn't get some traction in the way that things done. Let's have a look. Francis, most of the courses are practical. It really depends on what we mean by practical. I mean, we've got courses that are quite practical, relating to some of our customs teams, for example. I'd be generally asking, well, what is it that needs to be covered? One of the problems we've got is, under COVID-19 lockdown, is are people actually out and about and able to do things practically? One of the things that I did when I worked in local government is we had an issue with employees working on our bin lorries. So I worked in a local council, and we had bin lorries which relied on agency workers who would work across maybe a number of London boroughs. So they might be in one borough one day and then work in another borough the next day. One of the problems they had was, well, how do they know which parts of the machine and how to make the machine work? So how could they use it? So what we did is we ended up putting a mobile phone on the machine, which there was anyway, because if they had any issues. And then what we did is we got people to do videos. We didn't make them. The teams themselves did them. Basically said, this is the video, this is how this works, this is how this works, this is how this works. And then that was on the appliance. Then when somebody needed to know how to use it, if they didn't, they just went along and they saw it there for themselves. They got an opportunity to practice before they then went out on the road. So relatively straightforward way of doing it. It seems a bit simple, but if it works, then what's the problem? Let's have a look down in the chat. Just having a look. Measuring the value impact of digital training interventions. Has there been any change? So Natasha, let's read this. How are we measuring the value impact of digital training interventions? Okay, so the first part of the question is that that's part of our input and output data. So actually, what I'm really keen on is understanding digital data more effectively. I'll give you an example. The example I generally talk about is sickness absence. So every organisation offers sickness absence courses. Everybody offers sickness absence courses to their managers. And a lot of those will be digital and online. But most organisations still have pretty much the same level of sickness absence. So what effect are those sickness absence courses having? And what we don't do is collect the right data. So what we should be doing is, if there's a certain video that people look at, which helps them, then why is that video so popular? If people are going to a checklist and we're getting 10 times more hits on an HR checklist than we are on a learning product, I'd want to find out why. I'd want to look at lines of business and teams and see, well, which teams have got lower sickness absence and what learning have their managers done, because that's how we should be recording it. So what we shouldn't be doing is looking at the intervention, seeing what difference it makes. What we should be doing is looking at performance and understanding what interventions are having an effect on it. And I think that's one of the problems we have in terms of the assessment evaluation. And we did this conversation when we were covering the assessment evaluation module. What we did was talk about, well, what's the point of the evaluation? And it is not to evaluate the quality of the product. It is to evaluate the quality of the performance. Let's have a quick flick through, see if there's any more questions. Just looking for any questions. Scroll through. We've got time for one more question. The next question that comes in will probably be an answer because that's about the next one. I can't scroll to. Let's see. I can see a few people typing. Shabana's typing. Gareth's typing. Let's have a quick scroll back through. How easy, oh, nice question by James. How easy to carry out formative assessment in online learning? That's a really interesting question, James, and something I would highly recommend. One thing that you can do is, and one thing I would suggest is, if you can, try and build in peer assessment within learning. So, individual wants to learn about a topic, they complete a quiz. It's not assessed by the subject matter expert or facilitator. What it does, it goes to the previous cohort, and the previous cohort assess it. A couple of benefits from that. Number one, you're building up community between this person and the previous cohort. What you're also doing is spacing the learning out for that previous cohort, saying, you did that some months ago, do you still understand it now? And the third benefit is you're saying to the individual now, rather than you just be assessed now, you are now going to assess somebody in 2, 3, 4, 8, 9 months' time. And what you're then doing is establishing that chain of knowledge within the business. So yeah, highly recommend that if you're thinking about formative assessment, use peer assessment for formative assessment, and you will probably get much stronger relationships as a result. That's me just about done.
Thank you very much, Andrew. That was a brilliant session. I really enjoyed it. Excuse me, I've got your frog in my throat now. Just to say to everybody, the slide deck is available underneath the useful resources. The useful resources are things which the presentation team behind the scenes have been collecting from your chat box and your chat inputs. So there are things there which you can download. You can actually highlight all the text in the useful resources from the session and copy paste, or you can click on some of those links. I'd like to say thank you once again to our sponsor Omniplex, and thank you very much not just to Donald but to the supporting presentation team behind the scenes. There are 6 people working on this simultaneously. We've had several hundred attendees today. It's been really useful, and as time is pressing, I will be stopping recording and exiting this meeting. The next session is coming up